Hello and welcome to our auxiliary study, if you will. As I was preparing for our study of Hebrews 8 and 9, ran across William Barclay's description of the tabernacle and the Day of Atonement, and I found that to be very helpful and enlightening, and just wanted to have the opportunity to share that with anyone who is interested in learning more about that. This is from his letter to the Hebrews in the Daily Bible Study series. It's published by John Knox Press, and I'm just going to read from his commentary simply because I can't paraphrase it well. He says it better than I can, and so I'm going to share his words. If you find this boring, just turn it off, but you may be interested as I was. We'll begin with his translation of Hebrews 9, 1 through 5, and then go into his description. So then the first tabernacle too had its ordinances of worship and its holy place, which was an earthly symbol of the divine realities. For the first tabernacle was constructed, and in it there was a lampstand and the table with the showbread, and it was called the holy place. Behind the second curtain there was that part of the tabernacle which was called the Holy of Holies. It was approached by means of the golden altar of incense, and it had in it the Ark of the Covenant, which was covered all over with gold. In the ark there was the golden pot with the manna, and Aaron's rod which budded, and the tables of the covenant. Above it there were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat, but this is not the place to speak of all these things in detail. And Barclay says, the writer to the Hebrews had just been thinking of Jesus as the one who leads us into reality. He has been using the idea that in this world we have only pale copies of what is truly real. The worship that we can offer is just a ghost-like shadow of the real worship which only Jesus, the real high priest, can offer. But even as he thinks of that, his mind goes back to the tabernacle. The tabernacle, remember, not the temple. Lovingly he remembers its beauty. Lovingly he lingers on its priceless possessions. And the thought in his mind is this: if earthly worship was as beautiful as this, what must true worship be like? If all the loveliness of the tabernacle was only a shadow of reality, how surpassingly lovely the reality must be. He does not describe the tabernacle in detail. He only alludes to some of its treasures. This was all he needed to do because his readers knew its glories and had them fixed in their memories. But we do not know them, therefore let us see what the beauty of the earthly tabernacle was like, always remembering that it was only a pale copy of reality. The main description of the tabernacle in the wilderness is in Exodus chapters 25 through 31 and chapters 35 through 40. God said to Moses, "Make me a sanctuary so that I may dwell among them." Exodus 25:8. It was constructed out of the free will offerings of the people, who gave with such lavish generosity that a halt had to be called to their giving. Beautiful story there in Exodus 36, 5 through 7. Barclay continues. The court of the tabernacle was 150 feet long and 75 feet wide. It was surrounded by a curtain-like fence of fine twined linen, 7.5 feet high. The white linen stood for the wall of holiness that surrounds the presence of God. The curtain was supported by 20 pillars on the north and south sides and by 10 on the east and west sides. And the pillars were set in sockets of brass and had tops of silver. There was only one gate. It was on the east side, and it was 30 feet wide and 7.5 feet high. It was made of fine twined linen with blue, purple, and scarlet yarns. In the court there were two things. There was the bronze altar, 7.5 feet high, 7.5 feet square, and 4.5 feet high, made of acacia wood sheathed in brass. Its top was a bronze grating on which the sacrifice was laid, and it had 4 horns to which the offering was bound. This was there. Then there was the laver. The laver was made from the brass mirrors of the women. Glass mirrors did not exist at that time. but its dimensions are not given. The priests bathed themselves in the water in it before they carried out the sacred duties. The tabernacle itself was constructed of 48 acacia beams, 15 feet high and 2 feet 3 inches wide. They were overlaid with pure gold and rested in sockets of silver. They were bound together by outside connecting rods and by a wooden tie beam which ran through their center. The tabernacle was divided into two parts. The first, 2/3 of the whole, was the holy place. The inner part, 1/3 of the whole, a cube 15 feet on each side, was the Holy of Holies. The curtain which hung in front of the holy place was supported on 5 brass pillars and made of fine linen worked in blue, purple, and scarlet. The holy place contained 3 things. One, there was the golden lampstand. It stood on the south side. It was beaten out of a single piece of solid gold. The lamps were fed with pure olive oil and were always lit. On the north side stood the table of the showbread. It was made of acacia wood, covered with gold. It was 3 feet long, 1.5 feet wide, and 2 feet 3 inches high. Every Sabbath, 12 loaves were made of the finest 12 loaves made of the finest flour were laid on it in 2 rows of 6. Only the priest could eat these loaves when they were removed. They were changed every Sabbath. There was the altar of incense. It was of acacia wood, sheathed in gold. It was 1.5 feet square, 3 feet high. On it, incense, symbolizing the prayers of the people rising to God, was burned every morning and evening. In front of the Holy of Holies was the veil, which was made of fine twined linen, embroidered in scarlet, purple, and blue, and with the cherubim upon it. Into the Holy of Holies no one but the high priest might enter, and he only once a year on the Day of Atonement, and only after the most elaborate preparations. Within the Holy of Holies stood the Ark of the Covenant. It contained 3 things. The golden pot of manna, see Exodus 16, 31 to 33. Aaron's rod that budded, see Numbers 17:8, and the tables of the law. It was made of acacia wood, sheathed outside and lined inside with gold. It was 3 feet 9 inches long, 2 feet 3 inches wide, and 2 feet 3 inches high. Its lid was called the mercy seat. On the mercy seat there were 2 cherubim of solid gold with overarching wings. It was there that the very presence of God rested, for he said, "There I will meet you," and from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubim that are on the Ark of the Covenant. It was of all this beauty that the writer to the Hebrews was thinking, and yet it was only a shadow of reality. In his mind, there was another thing of which he was to speak again. The ordinary Israelite could come only to the gate of the tabernacle court. The priests and the Levites might enter the court, and the priests alone might enter the holy place, and none but the high priest might enter the Holy of Holies. There was beauty, but it was a beauty in which the ordinary people were barred from the inner presence of God. Jesus Christ took the barrier away and opened wide the way to God's presence for everyone. In the next section, verses 6 through 10, we'll start with Barclay's translation. Since these preparations had been made, the priests continually enter into the first tabernacle as they perform the various acts of worship. But into the second tabernacle, the high priest also enters, and that the high priest alone enters, and that once a year, and not without blood, which he offers for himself and for the errors of the people. By this the Holy Spirit is showing that the way into the holy place was not yet opened up so long as the first tabernacle stood. Now the first tabernacle stands for this present age, and according to its services, sacrifices are offered which cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but which, since they are based on food and drink and various kinds of washings, are human regulations laid down until the time of the new order should come. This commentary is this, and here's a description of the Day of Atonement. Only the high priest could enter into the Holy of Holies, and then only on the Day of Atonement. It is of the ceremonies of that day that the writer to the Hebrews is thinking here. He did not need to describe them to his readers because they knew them. To them, they were the most sacred religious ceremonies in all the world. If we are to understand the thought of the writer to the Hebrews, we must have a picture of them in our minds. The main description is in Leviticus 16. First, we must ask, what was the idea behind the Day of Atonement? As we have seen, the relationship between Israel and God was a covenant relationship. Sin on Israel's part broke that relationship, and the whole system of sacrifice existed to make atonement for sin and to restore the broken relationship. But what if there were some sins still not atoned for? What if there were some sins of which the people were not conscious? What if by some chance the altar itself had become defiled? That is to say, what if the sacrificial system was not performing the function it should? The summary of the Day of Atonement is given in Leviticus 16:33. He shall make atonement for the sanctuary, and he shall make atonement for the tent of meeting, and for the altar, and he shall make atonement for the priests and for all the people of the assembly. It was one great comprehensive act of atonement for all sin. It was a splendid day in which all things and all people were cleansed, so that the relationship between Israel and God should continue unbroken. To that end, it was a day of humiliation. You shall deny yourselves. It was not a feast, but a fast. The whole nation fasted all day, even the children. And really devout Jews prepared themselves for it by fasting 10 days beforehand. The Day of Atonement comes 10 days after the start of the Jewish New Year, about the beginning of September in our calendar. It was the greatest of all days in the life of the high priest. Let us see what happened. Very early in the morning, the high priest cleansed himself by washing. He put on his gorgeous robes of office, worn only on that day. There were white linen breeches and a long white undergarment, and the long white undergarment reaching down to the feet, woven in one piece. There was the robe of the ephod. It was dark blue and was a long robe, which at its foot had a fringe of blue, purple, and scarlet tassels made in the form of pomegranates, interspersed with an equal number of little golden bells. On this robe, he put the ephod itself. The ephod was probably a kind of linen tunic, embroidered in scarlet and purple and gold, with an elaborate girdle. On its shoulders were 2 onyx stones. The names of 6 of the tribes were engraved on one stone and 6 on the other. On the tunic was the breastplate, a span about 9 inches square. On it were 12 precious stones with the names of the 12 tribes engraved on them. So the high priest carried the people of God on his shoulders and on his heart. In the breastplate there was the Urim and Thummim, which means lights and perfections. There's reference to Exodus 28:30. What exactly the Urim and Thummim was is not known. It is known that the high priest consulted it when he wished to know the will of God. It may be that it was a precious diamond inscribed with the consonants IHWH, which are the consonants of Yahweh, the name of God. On his head, the high priest put the tall meter of fine linen, and on the meter was a gold plate bound by a band of blue ribbon. On the plate were the words, "Holiness unto the Lord." It is easy to imagine what a dazzling figure the high priest must have appeared on this, his greatest of all days. Okay, the high priest began by doing the things that were done every day. He burned the morning incense, made the morning sacrifice, and attended the trimming of the lamps on the 7-branched lampstand. Then he came to the first part of the special ritual of the day. Still dressed in his gorgeous robes, he sacrificed a bullock and 7 lambs and 1 ram. Then he removed his gorgeous robes, cleansed himself again in water, and dressed himself in the simple purity of white linen. There was brought to him a bullock, bought with his own resources. He placed his hands on its head, and standing there in full sight of the people, confessed his own sin and the sin of his family. "Ah, Lord God, I have committed iniquity. I have transgressed. I have sinned, I and my house, O Lord. I entreat thee, cover over, atone for, the iniquities, the transgressions, and the sins which I have committed, transgressed and sinned before you. I and my house, even as it is written in the law of Moses thy servant. For in that day he will cover over, atone for you, and make you clean. For all your transgressions before the Lord you shall be cleansed. For the time being, the bullock was left in front of the altar. And then followed one of the unique ceremonies of the Day of Atonement. 2 goats were standing by, and beside the goats was an urn with 2 lots in it. One lot was marked for Yahweh, the other was marked for Azazel, which is the phrase the Authorized Version translates as the scapegoat. The lots were drawn and laid on the head of each goat. A tongue-shaped piece of scarlet was tied to the horn of the scapegoat, and for the moment the goats were left. Then the high priest turned to the bullock, which was beside the altar, and killed it. Its throat was slit, and the blood was caught in a basin by the priest. The basin was kept in motion so the blood would not coagulate, for soon it was to be used. Then came the first of the great moments. The high priest took the coals from the altar and put them in a censer. He took the censer and put it in a special dish, and then he walked into the Holy of Holies to burn incense in the very presence of God. It was laid down that he must not stay too long, lest he put Israel in terror. The people literally watched with bated breath, and when he came out of the presence of God, still alive, there went up a sigh of relief like a gust of wind. When the high priest came out of the Holy of Holies, he took the basin of the bullock's blood and went back into the Holy of Holies, then sprinkled it 7 times up and 7 times down. He came out, killed the goat that was marked for Yahweh, with its blood, re-entered the Holy of Holies and sprinkled again. Then he came out and mixed together the blood of the bullock and the blood of the goat, and 7 times sprinkled the horns of the altar of incense and the altar itself. What remained of the blood was laid at the foot of the altar of the burnt offering. Thus the Holy of Holies and the altar were cleansed by the blood from any defilement that might be on them. Then came the most vivid ceremony. The scapegoat was brought forward. The high priest laid his hands on it and confessed his own sin and the sin of the people. And the goat was led out into the desert, into a land not inhabited, laden with the sins of the people, and there it was killed. The priest turned to the slain bullock and goat, prepared them for sacrifice. Still in his linen garments, he read the scripture, Leviticus 16, Leviticus 23, 27 through 32, and repeated by heart Numbers 29, 7 through 11. He then prayed for the priesthood and the people. Once more he cleansed himself in water and dressed himself again in his gorgeous robes. He sacrificed first a young goat for the sins of the people. Then he made the normal evening sacrifice. Then he sacrificed the already prepared parts of the bullock and the goat. Then once again he cleansed himself, took off his robes, and put on the white linen. And for the 4th and last time he entered the Holy of Holies to remove the censer of incense which still burned there. Once again he cleansed himself in water. Once again he put on his vivid robes. Then he burned the evening offering of incense, trimmed the lamps on the golden lampstand, and his work was done. In the evening he held a feast because he had been in the presence of God and had come out alive. That was the ritual of the Day of Atonement, the day assigned to cleanse all things and all people from sin. That was the picture in the mind of the writer to the Hebrews, and he was to make much of it. But there were certain things of which he was thinking at the time. Every year, this ceremony had to be gone through again. Everyone but the high priest was barred from the presence, and even he entered. Let me restart that over. Every year, this ceremony had to be gone through again. Everyone but the high priest was barred from the presence, and even he entered in terror. The cleansing was a purely external one by baths of water. The sacrifice was that of bulls and goats and animal blood. The whole thing failed because such things cannot atone for sin. In it all, the writer to the Hebrews sees a pale copy of the reality, a ghostly pattern of the one true sacrifice, the sacrifice of Christ. It was a noble ritual, a thing of dignity and beauty, but it was only a shadow which could not succeed in its purpose. The only priest and the only sacrifice which can open the way to God for all men and women is Jesus Christ. Again, that is a reading from William Barclay's study on the letter to the Hebrews in his daily Bible series by John Knox Press. Thank you for joining us. I just thought these details might be helpful for some of you to get a clearer picture of the tabernacle and of the Day of Atonement. Thank you again.